Your Excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen, spoštovani, spoštovane, dober večer, good evening. It's an extraordinary hour, at least here in Europe, but I'm sure many night owls are still here with us at this conclusion of the opening day of the Bled Strategic Forum. Instead of carpe diem, we'll say carpe noctem and seize the night with a great debate on challenges of digitalization in our ever more connected, interdependent, and global world. My name is Jaka Repanšek, and it's my honor to host this Night Owl session titled Getting to Know Each Other. And thank you all for joining us at this late hour. Before I briefly touch on our topic, let me introduce our distinguished panelists. We're very sorry that our own Jure Leskovec was not able to join us this evening, but I'm sure we'll have a fruitful discussion and cover some of the topics which Jure is most familiar with and where we have so much more to do in the CE region and EU as a whole. Digital skills, innovative environment, research and development, and the best ways academic, business, and public sectors can join forces. With us this evening is Mr. Boris Andrijanič, Minister for Digital Transformation of the Republic of Slovenia. Prior to becoming minister, Mr. Andrijanič chaired the Strategic Council and is still chairing the Strategic Council for Digitalization of the Government of the Republic of Slovenia as of April 21. Mr. Andrijanič has experience in working for large international companies, and he also worked on EU's digital and economic citizenship and entrepreneurship. Mark still leads the Oxbridge Club Slovenia, which brings together us Slovenians who have studied at Oxford and Cambridge. Thank you, Mark, for being with us. Sir Nicholas William Peter Clegg, who is joining us virtually, is the Vice President for Global Affairs and Communications at Facebook since 2018. Having previously served as the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 2010 to 2015 and as leader of the Liberal Democrats from 2007 to 2015. Sir Clegg worked as a journalist for the Financial Times before becoming a member of the European Parliament in 1999. Thank you, Sir Clegg, for being with us, and greetings from Bled to California. Night Owl panel is dedicated to digitalization, getting to know each other before several panels on this topic, which will take place tomorrow, and which make this one of the most important topics at this year's Strategic Forum. Let me just briefly underline the most important issues we are covering at the forum and on which I believe we should all agree. First, digital technologies play an invisible but structural role in the delivery of products and services that EU citizens rely upon in day-to-day life. From public services to dating, our lives are both increasingly lived online or digitally enabled. Second, the COVID-19 pandemic more than ever highlighted the importance and the need for digital infrastructure and practical and smart digital regulation. Third, digitalization is key to economic growth and competitiveness in Europe. With this growth come new opportunities and challenges, in particular in privacy, in the growth of artificial intelligence, virtual and augmented realities, and many more exciting new technologies. But conversations around new technologies cannot be held in European isolation, and we must ensure that our governance frameworks are matched and reflected by the real needs in our digital societies. Data flows, for example, are part of that discussions. They are the grounds of the premise of a digitally enabled Europe. As one of tomorrow's panel states, like the train tracks of old, the future of Europe's economy needs to be built on an outward and global approach. Fourth, we have to ask ourselves, what is the right balance between inclusiveness, international collaboration, and autonomy? Fifth, growing digitalization, already touching every corner of our lives, has increased the importance of privacy and cybersecurity, which will also be an important part of our forum. Sixth, disinformation campaigns and fake news are emerging as a long-term threat to the values and the security of the entire world, as the line between information and disinformation becomes increasingly blurred. While there is a consensus that these challenges exist, there is no consensus yet on how to deal with it. This is another topic that cannot be resolved solely by us Europeans. So let me conclude. All European countries have much to gain from digitalization. Supporting ambitions towards a more competitive, inclusive, and green Europe with a progressive approach to digitalization must be one of our major goals. But these values in a global and interconnected world can be best fostered by working together with all like-minded countries and allies. Ensuring that the future global digital standards reflect our values of democracy and human rights will require a concerted efforts by all of us in all corners of Europe and the world. Mark, let me start by asking you the opening question. What is your vision of a successful digital Europe?
Thank you very much, dear Jaka, for this kind introduction. Since it's already quite late, I'll try to be a bit more concise than politicians usually are. First and foremost, it is my pleasure to welcome you in green and digital Slovenia. This is the home of cutting-edge research and innovation. We host UNESCO's first AI center and developed some of the finest electric planes in the world. Slovenia is also the birthplace of Talking Tom and many other iconic creatures from the world of digital entertainment. Not to mention the unspoiled nature that surrounds us and our amazing Olympic and Paralympic athletes that continue to dominate sports pages around the world. Now tonight, I wish to talk about the future and vision of Europe that's dynamic, creative, competitive, innovative, and above all, optimistic about the future. The good news is that Europe excels at creating and exporting forward-looking regulation. Just look at GDPR and our environmental legislation. These pieces of regulations have been copied all over the world, and we should be proud of that. The not so good news is that we're not nearly as good at creating and exporting digital services. For years, Europe has been lagging behind the US and also China when it comes to economic dynamism and technological progress. If you look at the top 30 global tech companies, you will only find one from Europe. That's SAP, that was established almost 50 years ago. In the last decade, over 600 startups around the world went on to become unicorns. Only 1 out of 8 is European. There is no doubt that we need comprehensive regulation of digital services and markets. We need it to safeguard our core values and to ensure fair competition. But at the same time, we need to create an environment that will breed the digital champions of tomorrow. How do we get there, of course, is a trillion-dollar question. First of all, we need to complete the single market, especially for digital and other services. That will enable our startups to scale their operations across the continent without being forced to hire a legion of lawyers. Second of all, we definitely need to boost research funding and encourage closer collaboration between our excellent universities and the private sector. And last but not least, we need to make it easier for our businesses to raise capital and attract top talent from around the world. Now, the EU is making significant progress on many of these fronts. Creating the European single market for data will be a game changer for the European digital economy. We're also increasing funding for strategic projects in AI and many other key areas. Moreover, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, worth over 670 billion euros, offers a historic opportunity to supercharge our digital and green transition. Modernizing healthcare, bridging the digital divide, and greening our economies are and will remain our top priorities. several European countries are already racing ahead, proving that it can be done. Estonia, for example, is a country of 1.8 million, yet it is a home of 4 tech unicorns. Sweden, on the other hand, boasts global tech giants such as Klarna and Spotify. And my dear friend Jurek, who's not here tonight, unfortunately, and many other members of the Digitalization Council, all of us are working very hard on making Slovenia the next digital and tech star of Europe. But no matter how ambitious or determined the EU is, we need to bear in mind the global nature of today's digital space. That's why we need strong transatlantic partnership, because that's the only way we can tackle the big issues facing us together. And these include cybersecurity, AI development, and of course, tech regulation. The EU and the US will never agree on every single detail, but we're bound by common values, economic interests, as well as strategic challenges. That's why the creation of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council in June is and will be the right step forward. And the Slovenian presidency of the Council of the EU is committed to making it work. United we stand, and divided we fall. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much for those introduction words. Nick, I would kindly ask you for your introductory remarks as well. You come from one of the largest companies in the digital world, Facebook, and we're living in pivotal moment for the global and European digital ecosystem. Where are we today, and where are we headed to? Please, Nick. Nick, can we hear you?
Hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, well, sorry, I'm not with you in person. I realise doing so remotely is a bit awkward, particularly since you've all just had a lovely dinner on a warm August evening in Slovenia, and I would love to be with you rather than sitting here in Silicon Valley. But I'm glad to be able to join you and Minister Andrijanič remotely. In answer to your question, I'm speaking not really only on behalf of Facebook. I also speak as a European, someone who spent many years of my life in European politics. I spent 10 years as a member of the European Parliament. I worked in the European Commission, and I would love, just as an individual, I would love my 3 children if they wanted to work for world-beating tech companies in the future, not to have to only look for employment in big tech companies in Silicon Valley or in China. And as the minister just himself said, whilst the EU has been a world leader in exporting regulation, it hasn't yet become a world leader in exporting digital services or growing significant new and fast-growing digital companies. And so we are at a very important sort of pivotal moment in the development of the governance of the internet space, and Europe plays obviously a crucial role in that. I think it is totally right that we see in Brussels, in Delhi, in Canberra, in DC, we see in political capitals around the world a desire to regulate and to introduce new legislation. I think that is entirely right. It's one of the reasons why Facebook has arguably been the most outspoken of the big US tech companies for some time now, advocating rather than rejecting new regulation on data portability, on privacy, on elections, on content and so on. And I think the principles behind the European Union's Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, which are the 2 sort of jumbo pieces of legislation, many of them are entirely legitimate. An emphasis on greater transparency, accountability, an aspiration to instill greater competition. And I should be entirely clear on behalf of one of the big Silicon Valley companies, we completely accept that with size and success comes additional responsibility. And part of the core design of the Digital Markets Act in particular is that there are greater responsibilities imposed upon some of the big systemic platforms. But, and here's the big but, new legislation itself does not create commercial success. And new legislation always, and I certainly learned this as a legislator for close to 20 years, there are always unintended consequences. And I suppose the point I would make as we have this discussion this evening is warn against the danger of sort of, as they say in English, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We are clearly experiencing a very significant societal sort of mood swing from the utopian, slightly naive, frothy belief that all technology and all technological innovation was good 5-10 years ago, and now the pendulum has swung almost to the other extreme, where all technology, and particularly perhaps social media, is regarded as bad. The truth clearly lies somewhere between. And so I hope that as European Union legislators finalize this legislation, they strike the right balance. And let me give you an example just of 3 things where I think the balance is quite delicate. I mean, firstly, there's a lot of criticism, some of it legitimate, some of it, in my view, misplaced, about how online ads work. But if we were to do what some people suggest, which is to basically either make it almost impossible to deliver personalized ads or to make it exceptionally difficult to do so, I think we would be sacrificing a great deal. 25 million small and medium-sized businesses in Europe rely on Facebook to reach their customers. And by independent assessment, they do so in a way which has created around 3 million jobs. Millions of companies around the world use social media, including Facebook, to reach customers much more cheaply. Many of them do so for free. And of course, the personalized ads business model is the reason why people can use tools like WhatsApp, Messenger, Instagram, Facebook for free. It doesn't matter whether you're a poor student in Guatemala or a fancy lawyer in Wall Street, you can use these amazing communication tools on exactly the same basis because you don't have to pay for it up front. And so that, again, I think as we regulate, for instance, online ads, we need to be very, very mindful of what a great benefit that business model has brought. Secondly, there's a legitimate debate, of course, always about privacy in the online world. And there's a real desire amongst regulators and lawmakers to make sure that data is kept safely and securely locked up in clear silos, that data cannot be irresponsibly moved from one surface to the other. But of course, if Europe wants to be innovative with the use of data in the future, it is indispensable that there is greater data sharing, that there is greater data portability. So there is just a tension, which we have to be open about, between the desire to have data locked down and the need to use data in an innovative way. And then the third and final point I would make is really what the minister alluded to, which is this is a global industry. This is a global phenomenon. And it is, in my view, indispensable that the European Union and the United States, and I would argue the European Union, the United States and India, the 3 main techno-democracies on the face of the planet, cooperate more fully together to keep data flows open. There is a very, very real danger that because of this complicated story around safe harbor, privacy shield, and the so-called Schrems rulings in the European Court of Justice, that data flows will not be kept open across the Atlantic between the European Union and the United States. That would be a devastating macroeconomic blow, not just to big companies like Facebook, but to thousands upon thousands of small companies that transfer data every millisecond of the day across the Atlantic. And if the EU and the US, final point I'd say on this, if the EU and the US are not able to maintain open data flows across the Atlantic, what possible hope do we have in Europe, or indeed in America, to rival the Chinese model of the internet, which is being so forcefully promoted by China around the world, which is based on a completely different set of values? So my closing sort of comment really is I really, really hope that as Europe legislates and regulates, it doesn't turn inwards. It doesn't apply protectionist philosophies to the global open data flows that are so important to our everyday lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Data flows, Schrems case that you mentioned is a topic maybe we'll return to a little bit later, but it's inevitable the solution is found as soon as possible between the US government and the European Commission and the member states in the European Union. Mark, to turn back to you, you're still a member and you're still heading the Strategic Council. It's an ambitious project. We've been waiting for a long time to have a list of really projects that work, projects that can actually bring us on the map of a developed digital country in the region. What are those projects? Can you discuss a little bit about them, the quick goals, something we really need to do fast to kind of get ahead a little bit more than we did in the last maybe 5 or 10 years, talking a lot, but not really working a lot. So please, Mark.
Thank you. So first of all, let me explain what Digital Council is. As you mentioned in the beginning, half a year ago, the government assembled around 40 top experts in the area of digital technologies to come up with very specific measures and solutions aimed at accelerating the digital transformation of healthcare, education, civil services, and the economy as a whole. What we realized at the time is that we had a number of strategies that had two things in common. First of all, they were all mostly very well written. And second of all, that there was no implementation whatsoever. And that reminded me of that famous quote by Sir Winston Churchill, who said, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at results. We've been busy drafting strategy, but we forgot about generating results. So our mandate was very clear. We need to produce proposals that will help eject Slovenia among 5 top digitally advanced countries in Europe by 2025. We came up with the first package of measures, 40 of them, 2 months later in June, and those included solutions from digital ID to establishing the International Research Center on Applied AI, from opening a tech embassy in the Silicon Valley to popularizing telemedicine and many, many other things. You mentioned digital skills. They are absolutely crucial for the development of any society, not just ours. And our ambitious proposal is to hand out free vouchers for digital skilling to the entire population, starting with seniors and other vulnerable groups. So no strategies, just concrete measures and results that can be achieved relatively fast. What we learned is that citizens are losing hope not just in technology, as mentioned before, but also in the ability of the government to execute. And we need to bring both of these things back. We need to show people that technology can actually simplify their lives. We need to prove to the businesses that technology is their ally. And we need to demonstrate that all of this can be done very, very soon. Maybe I would just return to Nick's point. We need to understand that any piece of regulation creates certain entry barriers, which are associated with costs. Now, big companies like Facebook can afford to pay any cost for operating in the world's largest market, which EU most definitely is. But what about the SMEs, the backbone of the European economy? I think we need to be super mindful of their interests and their appetite for additional regulation. So there's a very delicate balance to be struck, and we hope to achieve progress on that front very, very soon.
Thank you so very much. And the balance is a word we're going to hear a lot, I think, also in the other panels tomorrow. But just to add to your point, yes, but on the other hand, the connectivity of those SMEs with large platforms, not only large platforms, business models, 20 years of development cannot be cut with a single piece of legislation. It has to be something that's done organically. And I think this is the most important point here. We need to look on both sides and actually cooperate when we're preparing something that's going to work on a global level. You cannot put borders in the digital world. Everybody knows that. So basically, I think that balance that you mentioned at the end is going to be the most important thing when legislating. And by the way, legislating, Slovenian presidency, we're not going to touch too much on that. As we are an honest broker now, we can really discuss our position during the presidency. But 21 major digital files are on our table now. Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, e-privacy, etc., etc., etc. And we're playing a major role as an honest broker here. An honest broker looking at all the sides that something's going to work in the global markets. Just to add to your thought, thank you very much, Nick. If I may go back to you and ask you the following question. Technology, and in particular big tech, has been under fire over the past several years, but you remain optimistic about what tech can do. Why is that, please?
Well, firstly, I remain optimistic because I think if you look at the history of all disruptive technological evolution, you always tend to get this sort of back and forth where when the technology erupts, there is a huge amount of optimism about what, unrealistic optimism about what it can deliver. There is always a time delay between the technology itself and the regulatory and political response. I mean, it took many years before there was legislation for seatbelts in cars. And by the way, there is always a degree of societal concern. Sometimes it becomes a sort of form of moral panic about the effect of new technologies. We had it about television. I remember, I'm 54, and I remember when I was young, advertising started on terrestrial television when I was a kid in the 1970s in the UK. And I remember there were kids in my class whose parents would send the children out of the room when an advertisement turned up on television because they thought that the television advertisement would somehow curdle the innocent minds of their vulnerable young children. And I'm not denigrating those concerns, but I think that what we're living through, which is sort of an eruption of optimism, unrealistic optimism, then an eruption of perhaps excessive pessimism, followed then by, I hope, and this is why the debate we're having here about the DMA and the DSA is so important, sensible and proportionate and workable regulation, and that the pendulum then comes to rest, and that crucially over time, that people feel confident that tech is there to serve society, not that society is there to serve tech. And that is why I think the debates we're living through now are so important. And throughout all of that, my optimism is not only sustained, it's been accelerated by, look what technology has done to the world through this pandemic. It's unbelievable. Not only, by the way, technology, but look at what science has done. I mean, no one expected that these vaccines could be rolled out as quickly as they were. No one understood that we would be able to get millions, alas, not enough around the world, but millions of school children still educated online. No one thought we'd be able to carry on working remotely without being, physically proximate to each other. So I look at the way, as I alluded to earlier, look at the way in which millions of small and medium-sized businesses have used digital tools not only to stay afloat, but in many cases actually to identify new customers during this huge global pandemic. So I know I know it's very fashionable to be sort of unremittingly critical and pessimistic about technology. I remain unfashionably optimistic, and I think it's been proven by the way in which individuals, businesses, families, and communities have used technology through this unprecedented time that the world has gone through in recent months.
Thank you so very much, Nick. Mark, you mentioned Estonia, but there's also other digital champions that we are looking as a role model. We have an ambitious plan until 2025 in Slovenia. We know what we need to do. We need to be practical and start working and not just strategizing, as you mentioned. But in CE region, which champions can you maybe identify? Who are our role models, not only in the region, maybe also globally? Who are we looking up to saying, okay, they have some successful models, practical things, which we can, try to copy or maybe use in a good example. So perhaps if you can comment a little bit on that. And maybe the second question, CE region is or could be, in a way, Europe's Asia. We have a lot of potential, but there's still something missing to get there. Maybe if you can comment also on that, as CE region is also an important part of our forum this year in Bled. Please, Mark.
Excellent. So let me first say that I share the unfashionable optimism about technology. I think in the digital world, size really doesn't matter. And that creates enormous opportunities for smaller countries like ours. In Europe and in our neighborhood, we have some tremendous examples, be it Israel, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, and some others. I'm very grateful that we are collaborating very closely with our counterparts in all of these countries to learn from their mistakes and successes, because they've been doing incredible things in the past decade already. Now, you mentioned CEE. I totally agree. I think it's the Asia of Europe in many ways. First of all, it's been an economic engine for a very long time already. Countries like Poland, for example, haven't experienced a recession until COVID-19 crisis.
And by the way, Poland, Poland has the biggest number of big international tech companies globally in Warsaw.
So if CEE is the Asia of Europe, Poland is the China of Europe. It has strong domestic market, it's open to innovation, and most of all, CEE does not have the same kind of, or let me put it this way, we do not fear changes. We've gone through so many changes in the past 30 years that we don't dread reforms, we welcome them. Whereas in other parts of Europe, people are usually a bit more reserved when it comes to all things new. And that, I think, has been one of CEE's recipes for success. The legislation has been usually a lot more pro-innovation. The university systems are very, very good. And it's great to see that a lot of young people that left this region some time ago are finally coming back, because the opportunities in places like Warsaw and many other CE cities are plentiful. So I'm very optimistic about CE. Obviously, as any place, we do have our issues, be it political, economic, or social, but we've been the economic engine of Europe, and we intend to remain one in the long term.
Thank you so very much for those optimistic words. Again, Nick, going back a little bit more to technology, before we'll also open the panel for our dear guests and their questions, we've seen Facebook talking about future-looking technologies like augmented and virtual reality, for example. But how does that correspond to your goal to connect the world? How do you put that in the global perspective? Please, Nick.
Well, I think, this is certainly the belief of those of us at Facebook, which is that every few years there is this platform shift. We moved from desktops to laptops. We moved from laptops to, mobiles. We live on mobiles. What is going to be the next computing platform? And in our view, the most likely next computing platform is going to be around the technologies of augmented and virtual reality. And it's all about connection. It's all about enriched connection. It's in a sense moving from a 2D internet to a 3D internet. So instead of seeing me as you see me now on a sort of flat screen, in future, the three of us would be able to sit around that table, either as holograms of ourselves or as avatars of ourselves. And by the way, this reality it's not as sort of futuristic as it sounds. I now, on a weekly basis, have weekly meetings with my team inside Facebook through Oculus 2 goggles, through Horizon workrooms, and we sit in a virtual meeting table. And if I see an avatar sitting to my right, the sound comes from my right. If I see an avatar opposite me, the sound comes from opposite me. If they move around, the sound moves around. There's an extraordinary sense of embedded presence. And I have to say, particularly after, the last year and a half or so of spending, like all of us, my whole working day looking at sort of the gallery formation on Zoom screens, it's actually been a really exciting experience to kind of feel that I am virtually in the same room with people. And look, we will look back on these technologies, the headsets and all of this, we will look back on it in 10 years' time and say, oh, we'll laugh and say, oh, wasn't that primitive? Because no doubt we will be wearing much lighter headgear. The holograms will be much more realistic than the avatars are now. But I think the ambition is precisely to do what you describe in your question, which is how do you use technology to promote a real sense of presence, a real sense of connection? Because at the end of the day, human beings aren't going to change. We all have a very, very primitive and strong longing to be with each other, to connect with each other. And if we can use technology to do that in a way which almost entirely evaporates the effect of geography and of distance, that really is a very, very thrilling future. It's a thrilling future culturally, socially, but also economically. I mean, the whole new economy opens up in terms of how people will buy and sell digital goods, which are already happening on a number of other platforms. You just need to look at what the gaming community is doing these days, in the way in which digital goods and digital credits are bought and sold amongst the gaming community, to get a slight sense of what the future may hold.
Thank you so very much. Just one more question for both of you before we turn to, Mark, did you want to add something to that? Before we turn to our audience, everything you mentioned now, Nick, also or largely depends on digital skills. We mentioned that a few times today. Jura was supposed to talk more about that as being a professor at Stanford of computer sciences. But Mark and then Nick, digital skills are something that we will need to have to use any new technology, to be able to use today's technologies. COVID made us all a little bit more literate when it comes to computers, but that's not going to help when it comes to like artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and all the new things coming up in the next years. So how are we practically, in a generational gap we have, with technologies available, with resources available, how are we going to boost digital skills by 2025, for example, as our goal is in many fields in Slovenia? Mark, first you, please.
Jaka, thank you very much. Before answering your question, I would like to give you a very specific example of the benefits generated by prudent and forward-looking regulation that's adopted fast. So in my previous life, I worked for a well-known American ride-sharing company. Now, Estonia was the first country in Europe to regulate, or let's put it this way, legalize ride-sharing. What was the result of that? Today, Uber's biggest and fiercest competitor in Europe, Middle East, and Africa is an Estonian company called Bolt. Estonians, with forward-looking legislation that was adopted in 2017, opened the floodgate for their domestic innovators and entrepreneurs. And the result is a multi-billion-dollar company called Bled. And that's, I think, the best example of what happens if a country looks a couple of years ahead and enacts legislation that's pro-innovation and future-proof. Now, sorry, Jaka.
Please go ahead. I mean, something about digital skills, maybe, just practically.
So that's the core thing. And we've been doing two things in terms of digital skilling. First of all, we will introduce a mandatory course in digital skills in all the primary and secondary schools in this country. But we need to be aware of one thing, that we all need sophisticated digital skills nowadays. And the digital divide, obviously, with the pandemic and this digital switch that was near complete, exacerbated the problem. So school children obviously are incredibly tech savvy, probably much more than all of us here. But we shouldn't forget about our seniors, and that's why we're introducing free vouchers that will be used for programs and courses in digital skilling, and we will expand this program to all other parts of the population. And those courses will cover different grounds. You will be able to take very different programs and acquire very different sets of skills. And we will also be giving out free hardware for the ones that are actually taking those courses, especially when it comes to the seniors. So this is something that's quite easy to comprehend, not very easy to implement, but we're absolutely certain that it can be done in the next year.
Thank you so very much for that, Nick. Facebook's and other big tech companies' future obviously also relies or depends on digital skills in the larger population. Any thoughts on that? Maybe to deliberate also on what Mark said before. Facebook is investing a lot also in programs that are in boosting digital skills around the globe, but still some practical ideas or suggestions on how different nations in different stages could actually boost digital skills among the population and sort of close the digital divide, the digital gap between generations. Please, Nick.
I'm not sure if I've got any good answers about how to close the generation gap, but I think the emphasis that the Minister placed on starting young is clearly obvious. I think our university systems need to be supple and flexible and ready to adapt their own degree courses to meet some of the new technological innovations. So it seems to me obvious that there is going to be a very, very high demand in engineers who specialize in augmented and virtual reality. If the major investments that not just Facebook, but some of the other very big tech companies are making in that space bear fruit, there is clearly going to be and yet, I think it's surprising to me how few universities have tried to adapt their own course structures and their own certifications and degrees to meet that future need. And then look, the third thing I'd say is just a generic thing, which is if we want a population of particularly younger entrepreneurial outward-facing folk who are going to be able to grasp the opportunities of the future, I think it's important to talk about tech, as we alluded to earlier, not just out of using the language of fear or of pessimism, but also of opportunity and optimism. And I do think one of the reasons why countries like Estonia have been so successful, small though they are, is that they've always had a very kind of future-facing and outward-looking approach to tech generally, rather than thinking that it's something that you need to protect your population from. You need to somehow build new barriers. And I guess, you know, look, I've been in politics for many years. I understand that the kind of pendulum swing away from globalization means that it's much more fashionable now to talk about building walls, building barriers, you know, cutting big companies down to size. All of that is extremely fashionable and politically popular right now, but it doesn't mean that it's right. And it doesn't mean that in the long run, that's the way to foster the appetite that we want to instill in young people to seek out these new digital skills. And so, you know, back to some of the things we touched on earlier, the more that governments and regulators can set a tone which is mindful of the downsides of technological innovation, of which, of course, there are many downsides, if they could balance that with a persistent and consistent message of openness rather than protectionism, and of being forward-looking and not backward-looking, I think that will itself help lots of young people to develop the motivation to develop digital skills themselves.
Thank you very much. Legislation must boost innovation, there is no doubt about that. It's really late here in Slovenia, Nick. It's almost 11 p.m. It's a bit earlier in California. So we're going to conclude shortly in a few minutes here, but we're going to let the audience perhaps ask a question or two to our distinguished guests. Please, if you can raise your hand and just ask a question. We have a question back there. Hi. You can just stand up so we can hear you. For Mark. Okay.
years from here, and by 2050 climate neutrality. And so the business ecosystem will definitely change a lot. So digitalization is the tool to help foster this.
Okay.
This is one question, how to help the business. And the other question is for IT sector, which is a huge polluter also of CO2 and other emissions. How will you help reducing IT sector in Slovenia and globally?
Thank you so very much. Nika, if you didn't hear that, it's a question about the green technologies, the connection between digital and green for Mark. So Mark, please, I'll let you answer that question or maybe comment on the thoughts that we heard.
Thanks, Anna, for this question, and congratulations to you for all the great work that you've been doing with your organization. I would like to say that we are actually establishing a new working group within the Strategic Council that will deal precisely with the green and digital transition, and will focus on solutions, on digital solutions that can actually help us complete this transition, this green transition, as soon as possible. And here, luckily, Slovenia has a lot to offer. We have strong, sustainable tech, a lot of companies that are exporting all over the world, and we'll definitely invite the representatives to join this working group.
Thank you so very much. The organizers are waving that we need to conclude. Now, don't be worried, because there's 4 panels on digital tomorrow, or at least partially on digital. So a lot of those topics, if not all, and Mark and I will be sitting at the panel at 9 o'clock in the morning again, talking about digital in the CE region, will be addressed in details. So the questions that you had for now, please reserve for tomorrow. We'll be able to answer at those panels. Nick, Mark, thank you so very much for being with us. Nick in an earlier hour, Mark in a later hour. Thank you, everybody here, for staying awake. Have a great evening. It's going to be very short. See you tomorrow morning at the next panels. And thank you so very much for attending. So have a great evening and good night.